Just turn around and leave me. The tear in my eye drops on the floor alongside my speed. My knees are drenching in the blood I spill just to get here. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. My lonely way. I never pray to God anymore. I'd rather no one hurt me. Redemption, I have waited for you to come and drown all my sin. My knees are drenching in the blood I spill just to get here. When I look around me, everything I had went up in flames. I don't wanna fight anymore. Just turn around and leave me. The tear in my eye drops on the floor alongside my speed. My knees are drenching in the blood I spill just to get here. When I look around,
Okay, I am ready to get started.
everything I had
Starting
went
early
up
tonight.
in flames. My lonely way.
Okay, good evening. So we're starting a new story tonight. Oh, wait a minute. Whoops, I forgot to finish changing the title here. Sorry about that. Let me do that. There we go. Starting a new book tonight. Thomas Sowell, Social Justice Fallacies. It's only 5 chapters, so it should be a fairly quick read. I'm not going to be able to read it in one sitting, but yeah. Anyway, so jump straight on into it. Actually, I'm going to show you the title. He doesn't mess around with this, or not the title, the cover. He doesn't mess around with his covers. This is one of 2 covers. The other one is slightly more complex, but that's basically it. That is the cover. The other one has a set of scales also in red just below the word fallacies, and that's it. So, anyway, here we go. So, he starts off with what he has titled as an epigraph. It's a quote: "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts." And that is from Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And chapter 1: Equal Chances Fallacies. Back in the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau expressed the essence of the social justice vision when he wrote of the equality of which the equality which nature established among men and the inequality which they have instituted among themselves. Wow, I can't read tonight. End quote. In the end of the yeah, jeez, let's slow down. In the kind of world envisioned by Rousseau, all classes, races, and other subdivisions of the human species would have equal chances in all endeavors, other things being equal. But the more other things there are influencing outcomes, the lower the chances of all those other things being equal. In the real world, there is seldom anything resembling the equal outcomes that might be expected if all factors affecting outcomes were the same for everyone, even in a society with equal opportunity. In the sense of judging each individual by the same standards, people from different backgrounds do not necessarily even want to do the same things, much less invest their time and energies into developing the same kinds of skills and talents. In American sports, for example, blacks are very overrepresented in professional basketball, whites in professional tennis, and Hispanics in Major League Baseball. In professional hockey, where there are more teams in the United States than in Canada, there are more Canadian players than American players, even though the population of the United States is more than 8 times the population of Canada. There are also more hockey players from Sweden, nearly 4,000 miles away, in the NHL than there are hockey players from California, even though the population of California is nearly 4 times the population of Sweden. Different climates are among the many other things that are not equal. Colder climates with waterways frozen for months at a time offer more opportunities for more people to grow up developing the ice skating skills essential for hockey. Such climates are far more common in Canada and Sweden than in the United States in general or California in particular. Climate differences are among numerous other differences that can facilitate the development of such capabilities peoples in particular peoples and impede the development of other capabilities. At the heart of the social justice vision is the assumption that because economic and other disparities among human beings greatly exceed any differences in their innate capacities, these disparities are evidence of or proof of the effects of such human vices as exploitation and discrimination. These vices are in fact among the many influences that prevent different groups of people, whether classes, races, or nations, from having equal or even comparable outcomes in economic terms or other terms. But human vices have no monopoly as causes of economic and other disparities. It is especially difficult to make the case that inequalities of outcome can be automatically assumed to have been caused by discrimination by dominant majorities against subordinate minorities, when in fact many subordinate minorities have economically outperformed dominant majorities in many countries around the world and in many periods of history. A study of the Ottoman Empire, for example, found that none of the 40 private bankers listed in Istanbul in 1912 was a Turk, even though Turks ruled the empire. Nor was any of the 34 stockbrokers in Istanbul a Turk. Of the capital assets of 284 industrial firms in the Ottoman Empire employing 5 or more workers, 50% of these firms were owned by Greeks and another 20% were owned by Armenians. The Ottoman Empire was by no means unique. Racial or ethnic minorities who have owned or operated more than half of whole industries in particular nations have included the Chinese in Malaysia, Germans in Brazil, Lebanese in West Africa, Jews in Poland, Italians in Argentina, Indians in East Africa, Scots in Britain, Ibos, I guess, is that an IBOS? I've never read that before, in Nigeria, and Marwaris in India. By contrast, we can read reams of social justice literature without encountering a single example of the proportional representation of different groups in endeavors open to competition in any country in the world today or at any time over thousands of years of recorded history. Among the many factors that can prevent equal human potentialities from producing equally developed capabilities are factors over which humans have very little control, such as geography, and other factors over which humans have no control at all, such as the past. There are innumerable things that can create unequal chances, some of which are worth examining in some detail. To begin with, a very mundane example. Oh, we have started into an ad, it says. So I don't know when it'll actually pop up on your screen, but I'll hold off. Ad break ends in 42 seconds, it says, but it hasn't started. So I don't know. That's always a little perplexing to me when it's actually going to start. Well, hell. I guess I'll just wait until the timer runs out anyway, just in case some people are seeing the ad and some people aren't. So, yeah. I'm liking it so far. We're not even very far into it. Okay, it says that we are back, so we'll carry on. Among the many factors that can prevent equal human potentialities from producing equally developed capabilities are factors over which humans have very little control, such as geography, and other factors over which humans have no control at all, such as the past. There are innumerable things that can create unequal chances, some of which are worth examining in some detail. To begin with, a very mundane example of a demonstrable inequality of capabilities. Most of the leading brands of beer in the United States were created by people of German ancestry. China's Tsingtao beer was also created by people of German ancestry. Germans have also been prominent among beer producers in Argentina, Brazil, and Australia. In Europe, Germany has long been the leading producer of beer. It so happens that Germans were producing beer back in the days of the Roman Empire, when a particular people has been doing a particular thing for more than 1,000 years. Is it surprising if they tend to be more successful in that particular endeavor than others who have had no such history? Here we are not discussing innate potential for achievements in general, but developed capabilities for doing very specific things. Whatever the combination of circumstances that may have led Germans to begin brewing beer in ancient times, the skills they developed over the many centuries since then are a fact of life today. The same is true of other groups that have developed particular skills in other particular endeavors in the past. One of many things that no individual, no institution, and no society has any control over is the past. The past is irrevocable, and as a noted historian said, quote, "We do not live in the past, but the past in us," end quote. Germans are by no means unique in having particular things that they do better than many other people. Conversely, there are many things that other people do better than Germans. It is common, for example, to hear people speak of French cuisine or Italian cuisine, but seldom, if ever, do people speak of German cuisine or English cuisine. Yet these are all peoples in countries clustered together in Europe. Rome and Berlin are about the same distance from each other as New York and Chicago, while London and Paris are closer to each other than Los Angeles and San Francisco. The point here is that in what might seem like very similar circumstances, there can be very different histories, cultures, and outcomes in particular endeavors. Particular groups having particular skills in particular kinds of endeavors have been a common fact of life over the centuries and in countries around the world. Even if two groups happen to live in identical tangible surroundings today, how likely would they be to have had the same environmental influences throughout all the scores of millennia of human existence? Scots have long been internationally renowned for the quality of the whiskey they produce, as the French have been for their wines, but the Scots cannot match the French in producing wine because the grapes that grow in France do not thrive in Scotland's colder climate. There's no reason whatever why the Scots should be expected to be equal to the French in producing wine, or either of them equal to the Germans in producing beer. Neither race nor racism nor any other form of discrimination is necessary to account for such reciprocal inequalities, nor have those who automatically invoke discriminatory biases as explanations for unequal outcomes been able to cite any country anywhere in the world that has had the proportional demographic representation which they have made a criterion. Reciprocal inequalities. While group equalities in the same endeavors are by no means common, what is common are reciprocal inequalities among groups in different endeavors. The equality among different groups of human beings presupposed by those who regard disparities in outcomes as evidence or proof of discriminatory bias might well be true as regards innate potentialities, but people are not hired or paid for their innate potentialities. They are hired, paid, admitted to colleges, or accepted into other desired positions on the basis of their developed capabilities, relevant to the particular endeavor. In these terms, reciprocal inequalities might suggest equal potentialities without providing any basis for expecting equal outcomes. Even groups lagging in many kinds of achievement tend nevertheless to have some particular endeavors where they do not merely hold their own, but excel. Groups lacking in their educational backgrounds, for example, may lag in many other endeavors for which such a background is essential, and yet such generally lagging groups have often excelled in some other endeavors where personal talent and dedication are key factors. Sports and entertainment have long been among such endeavors, with high achievements for such American groups rising out of poverty as the Irish, blacks, and Southern whites. While group equality in either incomes or capabilities is hard to find, it is also hard to find any ethnic or other large social group that has no endeavor in which it is above average. Reciprocal inequalities abound, even when equality does not. As we have seen, different ethnic groups dominate different American sports. One consequence of this is that the degree of inequality of group representation in American sports as a whole is not as severe as in such individual as in each individual sport. A similar principle applies for similar reasons in other endeavors because of reciprocal inequalities. If one looks at wealthy historic individuals in commerce and industry, for example, one could find Jews far more widely represented among historic leaders in retailing, finance, and garment production and sales than in the steel industry, automobile production, or coal mining. In the professions as well, groups that have similar representation in the professions as a whole can have very different representations in particular professions, such as engineering, medicine, or the law. Asian American professionals have not necessarily concentrated in the same professions as Irish American professionals. Because of reciprocal inequalities, the more narrowly defined the endeavor, the less likely are different groups to be comparably represented. Yet crusaders for social justice often decry uneven representation of groups in an individual company as evidence or proof of employer discrimination in that particular company. When different peoples evolve differently in very different settings and conditions, they can develop different talents that create reciprocal inequalities of achievements in a wide range of endeavors without necessarily creating equality or even comparability in any of those endeavors. Such reciprocal inequalities lend no support to theories of either genetic determinism or discriminatory biases as automatic explanations of inequalities. Many assumptions and phrases in the social justice literature are repeated endlessly without any empirical evidence. When women are statistically underrepresented, quote unquote, in Silicon Valley, for example, some people automatically assume that to be due to sex discrimination by Silicon Valley employers. It so happens that the work done in Silicon Valley is based on an application of engineering skills, including computer software engineering, and American women receive less than 30% of the degrees in engineering, whether at the college level or the postgraduate level. When American men receive less than 20% of the undergraduate degrees in education and only 22% and 32% of master's degrees and doctoral degrees, respectively, in the same subject, is it surprising that men are underrepresented among school teachers and women are underrepresented in engineering occupations? Comparing the statistical representation of women and men in either of these occupations is like comparing apples and oranges when their educational specializations are so different. These educational specialization decisions were usually made individually years before either the women or the men reached an employer to begin a professional career. A more general question arises when the incomes of women as a whole are compared to the incomes of men as a whole. This leaves out many specific differences in the life patterns of women and men. One of the most basic of these differences is that women are full-time, year-round workers significantly less often than men. U.S. Census Bureau data showed that in 2019 there were 15 million more male full-time year-round workers than female full-time year-round workers. The work patterns of women include more part-time work, and some whole years when many women are out of the labor force entirely, often due to staying home to take care of young children. When these and other differences in work patterns are taken into account, male-female differences in income shrink drastically and in some cases reverse. As far back as 1971, single women in their 30s who had worked continuously since leaving school were earning slightly more than men of the same description. When there are statistical differences in the representation of various ethnic groups, different patterns within these groups themselves are likewise often overlooked. A typical example of equating differences in demographic representation with employer discrimination was a headline in a San Francisco newspaper. Why are black and Latino people still kept out of tech industry? Are Asians kept out of professional basketball or Californians kept out of National Hockey League? Is equal demographic representation so widespread or so automatic in other endeavors that its absence in a particular endeavor can only be due to someone keeping particular people out? As in the case of sex differences in demographic representation in an engineering endeavor, ethnic differences in educational qualifications for an engineering career are blatant. Asian Americans have more college degrees in engineering than either blacks or Hispanics, each of whom outnumbers Asian Americans in the U.S. population. At the PhD level, Asian Americans' engineering degrees outnumber the engineering PhDs of blacks and Hispanics put together. Such ethnic disparities in engineering degrees are by no means peculiar to the United States. In Malaysia during the 1960s, members of the Chinese minority received 408 engineering degrees, while members of the Malay majority received just 4. When comparing different ethnic groups in a given endeavor, we are again comparing apples and oranges in terms of specialized education or other specialized preparations. In these circumstances, equal opportunity in the sense of applying the same standard to everyone does not produce equal outcomes. Even if no one is kept out, there is no way that the Chinese in Malaysia could keep out Malay students in universities run by Malays and subject to the authority of the Malaysian government, also run by Malays. The disparate impact, quote unquote, standard used by courts of law for determining employer discrimination implicitly assumes something that no one can seem to find anywhere: equal demographic representation of different groups. Any number of scholarly international studies have found gross disparities common in countries around the world. One of these studies included, quote, "In no society have all regions and all parts of the population developed equally," end quote. Nevertheless, some justices of the U.S. Supreme Court have accepted disparate impact, quote unquote, statistics as evidence of proof of employer discrimination, even though the Supreme Court itself has had statistical disparities more extreme than the disparities used to charge employers with discrimination. For 8 consecutive years, from 2010 to 2017, all Supreme Court justices were either Catholic or Jewish, in a country where Protestants outnumber Catholics and Jews combined. Yet one of the most obvious reasons for doubting any negative intention or conspiracy is that these justices were appointed by presidents of both political parties, and all those presidents were Protestants. None of this denies that employer biases are a factor that can be and has been responsible for some disparities in employment outcomes. But human biases have no monopoly among the many things that prevent equal chances, quote unquote. Origins of inequalities. The question whether different social groups have equal or unequal capabilities in various endeavors is very different from the question whether racial or sexual differences create inherently different mental potential determined by genes. The genetic determinism assumption that reigned supreme among American intellectuals of the progressive era in the early 20th century is an irrelevant issue in this context, though it will be dealt with in Chapter 2 and has been dealt with more extensively elsewhere. If we assume for the sake of argument that every social group or even every individual has equal mental potential at the moment of conception, that would still not be enough to guarantee even equal native intelligence, quote unquote, at birth, much less equally developed capabilities after growing up in unequal circumstances and or being culturally oriented toward different goals in different fields. Inequalities among individuals. Unequal circumstances begin in the womb. Research has shown nutritional differences among pregnant women reflected later in IQ differences among their children when these children were old enough to be tested. Mothers' intakes of various substances can have positive or negative effects on a child's IQ and general well-being. Even where we might reasonably expect to find the greatest equality of developed capabilities among children born to the same parents and raised in the same home, research going back as far as the 19th century and including countries on both sides of the Atlantic has shown that children who were the first born in their family have, as a group, higher average IQ, a higher rate of college completion, and are overrepresented among high achievers in a variety of endeavors. In the United States, for example, a study found that more than half the National Merit Scholarship finalists were a firstborn child, even in 5-child families, as well as in 2-child, 3-child, and 4-child families. In other words, in 5-child families, the firstborn was the finalist more often than the other 4 siblings combined. Other measures of educational success or career success have likewise shown the firstborn and only child to be overrepresented among the top performers in various endeavors, whether in the United States or among top performers in other countries surveyed. The firstborn or an only child can have the undivided attention of both parents during a child's crucial earliest development. This is something which later siblings obviously cannot have. Conversely, children raised where there is only one parent present have been found in a number of studies to have a higher incidence of many social problems. Again, both in the United States and on the other side of the Atlantic. Studies of boys raised without a father present have found them very much overrepresented among people with pathologies ranging from truancy to murder. As one study put it, these pathologies were more highly correlated with fatherlessness than with any other factor, quote, surpassing even race and poverty, end quote. Fatherless boys had a higher than average rate of incarceration, whether they were black or white, though the incidence of fatherless boys has been higher among blacks. Not all differences between races are due to race, either in the sense of genetics or in the sense of racial discrimination. Clearly, there were no quote-unquote equal chances for these boys, whether they were treated fairly or unfairly by people they encountered in institutions ranging from schools to police departments. Girls are also affected negatively, as reflected in such things as higher rates of teenage pregnancy when raised by one parent. Very similar patterns of pathology were found in England, where the ethnic makeup of the underclass population is very different from that in the United States. In England, the underclass is predominantly white, but it shows many social patterns very similar to the social patterns of low-income blacks in the United States, even though the English underclass has no legacy of slavery, quote unquote, to be used as an automatic explanation. When American children are raised in different social classes with different child rearing practices, the chances of these children growing up with equal capabilities in adulthood can be seriously reduced. Research has shown that children raised by parents with professional occupations hear more than 3 times as many words per hour as children raised in families on welfare. Moreover, these are far more often positive and encouraging words when the parents are professionals, and more often negative and discouraging words when the family is on welfare. Can anyone seriously believe that children spending their formative years growing up in homes this different are likely to be the same as others in school, on a job, or elsewhere? In putting assumptions to the test of facts, a clear distinction must be maintained between equal potentialities at the beginning of life and equal developed capabilities later on. Some social justice advocates may implicitly assume that various groups have similar developed capabilities so that different outcomes appear puzzling. But when it comes to actual performance capabilities, a man is not even equal to himself, either physically or mentally, at different stages of his life, much less equal to all other people in their varying stages of life. Inequalities among groups. The seemingly invincible fallacy at the heart of the social justice vision is that large categories of people, classes, races, nations, would tend to be either equal or at least comparable in their outcomes in various endeavors, if it were not for some discriminatory bias that has intervened to produce the large disparities we see around us. Yet different groups with different median ages, varying by a decade or two, are unlikely to be equal in endeavors requiring either the physical vitality of youth or the experience that comes with age. When Japanese Americans have a median age of 52 and Mexican Americans have a median age of 28, their different representation in different occupations and at different income levels is hardly surprising. If these two groups were identical in every other aspect, age differences alone would still be enough to make them differ in incomes, since middle-aged Americans have higher median incomes than Americans in their 20s. With nations, as with classes, races, or ethnic groups, age differences alone are enough to make equal economic or other outcomes very unlikely. There are whole nations whose populations have a median age over 40, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and other nations whose median ages are under 20, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Angola. Why should anyone expect a nation where half the population are infants, young children, and teenagers to have the same work experience and education, the same human capital, as a nation where half the population is 40 years old or older? Different nations are also located in different geographic, climatic, and other settings with different advantages and disadvantages. Even if their populations had identical potential, they could hardly be expected to have equally developed capabilities after centuries of being confronted with the task of surviving and evolving in very different settings around the world. Whole continents differ greatly from one another. Although Africa is more than twice the size of Europe, the European coastline is thousands of kilometers longer than the African coastline. This might seem to be almost impossible, but the European coastline has innumerable twists and turns, creating harbors where ships can dock safely, sheltered from the rough waters of the open seas. These harbors are an even bigger advantage than the longer coastline as such. The European coastline is also increased by the many islands and peninsulas that make up more than one-third of that continent's total land area. By contrast, the African coastline is smooth, with far fewer harbors and far fewer islands and peninsulas, which make up only 2% of Africa's land area. Is it surprising that Europeans have long had the benefit of far more maritime trade than Africans? Adam Smith noted this geographic difference back in the 18th century, and he also rejected claims that Africans were racially inferior. Other scholars have likewise described the numerous and severe geographic handicaps of sub-Saharan Africa, especially. Distinguished French historian Fernand Braudel concluded, quote, "In understanding black Africa, geography is more important than history," end quote. Harbors are just one of the various kinds of navigable waterways with major implications for the economic and social development of human beings. That is because of the enormous differences in costs between water transportation and land transportation. In the ancient world, for example, the cost of transporting a cargo across the length of the Mediterranean Sea, more than 2,000 miles, was less than the cost of transporting the same cargo just 75 miles inland. This meant that people living on the coast had a vastly larger range of economic and social interactions with other coastal people and places than people living inland had with other people living inland or with their coastal compatriots. A geographic treatise noted that in ancient times, Europe's Mediterranean hinterland was, quote, lingering in a backward civilization as compared with the Mediterranean coastline, end quote. Nor was this peculiar to the Mediterranean region. It has been common in various parts of the world that, quote, the coasts of a country are the first part of it to develop, not an indigenous or local civilization, but a cosmopolitan culture which later spreads inland from the seaboard, end quote. There have been special exceptions, but this has been a general pattern. This, excuse me. This pattern reflected the great differences between the cost of water transportation and land transportation, which in turn affects economic prospects in many ways. Most of the large cities around the world are located on navigable waterways. Because transporting the huge volume of food required to keep people fed in those cities would be enormously more expensive if all food had to be transported solely over land, especially before the modern invention of railroads and trucks during the past 2 centuries. Even today, places with access to navigable rivers have great economic advantages, especially if these are navigable rivers that connect to coastal areas. Climate is another aspect of nature that can influence the economic and social development of human beings. Fertile soils are found more often in the temperate zones than in the tropics. This obviously affects the productivity of agriculture, but its effects do not end there. Urbanization depends on food supplied from outside urban communities, with agriculture usually being the primary source. Over the centuries, a whole disproportionate share of advances in science, technology, and other endeavors have originated in urban communities. An empirical study at Harvard's Center for International Development found that places in the temperate zone with fertile soil and located within 100 kilometers of the sea were 8% of the world's inhabited land area. But such places had 23% of the world's population and produced 53% of the world's gross domestic product. This is reflected in worldwide differences in income per person between such places and the rest of the world. This is just one of the many differences among the world's geographic regions. When Europeans arrived in the Western Hemisphere, the indigenous peoples had no horses, oxen, camels, or elephants, nor any other heavy-duty draft animals or beasts of burden to provide transportation for people and cargoes, such as animals provided in much of the Eastern Hemisphere. Llamas existed in the Inca Empire in part of South America, where they were used as beasts of burden, but even but even in that fraction of South America where llamas existed, they were not large enough to be comparable to the animals used in the other half of the world. The dearth of draft animals and beasts of burden in the Western Hemisphere had wider economic implications. By making land transportation even more costly than usual, the lack of animals limited the distances where it was economically feasible to transport cargoes. This in turn also limited the size of vessels for water transportation. Canoes were common in the Western Hemisphere, but vessels of the size of European ships, or the even larger ships in China during Europe's Middle Ages, were not economically viable without animals to transport the vast cargoes from miles around required to fill such ships. Nor were wheeled vehicles used in the Western Hemisphere before Europeans arrived. The wheel has sometimes been considered an epoch-making invention for economic development, but wheeled vehicles without animals to pull them had no such potential. The Mayans invented wheels, but they were used on children's toys. Had the Mayans been in communication with the Incas and their llamas, conceivably wheeled vehicles pulled by animals might have become an economic asset in the Western Hemisphere, but geographic limitations to the size of a cultural universe in the Western Hemisphere at that time prevented the creation of such a development. When the British confronted the Iroquois in North America, these were peoples drawing upon very different sized cultural universes. Although the Iroquois were a confederation of tribes living in a large area, the animals present on the vast Eurasian landmass and absent in the Western Hemisphere gave the British access to the inventions, discoveries, and knowledge from far wider regions of the world. The British were able to navigate across the ocean by using the compass, invented in China, steering with rudders, invented in China, doing calculations with mathematical concepts from Egypt, using a numbering system invented in India, and writing on paper invented in China using letters created by the Romans. Wow. The Iroquois had no comparable access to the cultural achievements of the Incas or the Mayans, nor did they have as wide an exposure to the many diseases that spread across the vast Eurasian landmass. spanning more than 10,000 kilometers, creating devastating epidemics in centuries past, but leaving the surviving populations in Europe with biological resistance to many diseases, whose germs they took with them to the Western Hemisphere. Those diseases devastated many indigenous populations who lacked biological resistance to those diseases. Death rates sometimes exceeded 50% or more among the indigenous peoples, facilitated the European conquest of North and South America. Neither with geographic factors nor other aspects of nature can we automatically assume either equal or random outcomes among human beings. There are too many factors at work to expect them all to be equal, or to have remained equal over the thousands of years in which human beings have developed economically and socially. Nature, as exemplified by such things as differences in geography, climate, diseases, and animals, has not been egalitarian, despite Rousseau's claim that nature produced equality. As distinguished economic historian David S. Landis put it, quote, nature, like life, is unfair, end quote, and, quote, the world has never been a level playing field, end quote. Numerous geographic influences varying from place to place do not imply geographic determinism. These and other factors interact with human knowledge and human errors as these have developed in different eras. Famines have occurred in places where there was very fertile land that produced food surpluses for export, both before the famine and after the famine. The supply of natural resources is not fixed, because what is a natural resource depends on what human beings know how to use, and that changes with changes in human knowledge from one era to the next. Western Europe and Northern Europe have long had more of the natural resources used in an industrial revolution, iron ore and coal, for example, than did Eastern Europe or Southern Europe. But none of that mattered during the many thousands of years before human beings' knowledge developed to the point where they were capable of creating an industrial revolution. Which part of Europe was more advantaged or disadvantaged varied with particular areas and the human knowledge available in those eras. Excuse me. I am actually going to pause there because my voice is starting to go. I'm going to go get some water. I will be right back in like barely a minute. I am going to go ahead and put the screen up though.
Prepare to die.
Okay, let's get back to it. Okay, available in those eras. Okay, nature has been no more fair between the sexes than in its treatment of other social groups, societies, or nations. Human double standards of sexual behavior for women and men have been a pale reflection of nature's more fundamental double standards. No matter how reckless, selfish, stupid, or irresponsible a man may be, he will never become pregnant. The plain and simple fact that women have babies has meant that they may not have equal chances in many other aspects of life, even when some human societies offer equal opportunity for people with the same developed capabilities. The seemingly invincible fallacy that only human bias can explain different economic and social outcomes among peoples is belied repeatedly by hard facts in societies around the world. Whatever the condition of human beings at the beginning of the species, scores of millennia had already come and gone before anyone coined the phrase social justice. During those almost unimaginably vast expanses of time, different peoples evolved differently in very different settings around the world, developing different talents that created reciprocal inequalities of achievements in different endeavors, without necessarily creating equality or even comparability in any of those endeavors. Environment and human capital. Environment cannot be defined as simply the current tangible surroundings, nor can human capital be defined as simply education or skills. Qualities such as honesty are not only moral virtues for individuals, but human capital for communities, their cultures, and their economies. Where a geographic setting offers only limited and isolated patches of marginally fertile land that can sustain only small communities living close to the margins of subsistence, there is little to gain from deception and everything to lose if the people in that environment do not stick together and be honest with one another, for the sake of the mutual trust and cooperation required for their survival in circumstances where survival is by no means secure. People living for centuries in small, poor, and isolated communities with neither police forces nor fire departments know that any emergency can become a catastrophe unless they all stick together and come to each other's rescue. Such circumstances, obvious to those who live in these circumstances, can promote honesty and cooperation more than any preaching or laws. Other people in very different and more favorable circumstances may or may not develop a comparable sense of honesty and cooperation. In short, honesty is one of many factors that cannot be assumed to be equally present in all places or among all peoples. Nor does empirical evidence suggest an equality in this factor any more than in many other factors. Among the simple tests used to assess the honesty in various peoples and places have been projects that deliberately left wallets containing both money and personal identification in public places in various cities around the world. When one such project in 2013 left a dozen wallets in public places in various cities, the number of wallets returned with the money still in them varied from 11 out of 12 in Helsinki, Finland, to 1 out of 12 in Lisbon, Portugal. Moreover, the one wallet that was returned in Lisbon was returned by a couple visiting from the Netherlands. No Portuguese returned any. An earlier test found 100% of the wallets returned in Norway, 67% in the United States, 30% returned in China, and 21% returned in Mexico. A different test of honesty was a 5-year study of which United Nations diplomats paid their parking tickets in New York City, where diplomatic immunity shielded them from prosecution. Egypt, with 24 UN diplomats, had thousands of unpaid parking tickets during the 5-year period. Meanwhile, Canada, with the same number of UN diplomats as Egypt, had no unpaid parking tickets at all during that same 5-year period. Nor did Britain, with 31 UN diplomats, or Japan, with 47 UN diplomats. John Stuart Mill pointed out in the 19th century that the level of honesty or dishonesty in a society has a major factor in the development of its economy. Using the high level of corruption in Russia as an example, Mill concluded that it must be, quote, an immense drag on the capabilities of economical improvement, end quote. Since then, whether under the czars, the communists, or in post-communist Russia, corruption has been pervasive. At one time, some individuals were described by fellow Russians as being, quote, as honest as a German, end quote. A tacit admission that such qualities were not nearly as common among Russians. Conversely, the Industrial Revolution in England was aided by investments from foreign countries, whose investors were able to rely on the reputation of British law for honesty and impartiality. There is no more reason to expect all individuals, groups, or nations to be equally honest than there is to expect them to have the same skills, the same wealth, or the same IQs. Even in countries with widespread corruption, where what has been called, quote, the radius of trust, end quote, seldom extends beyond the nuclear family, there can be particular groups who have sufficient trust among themselves that they can conduct business on the basis of verbal agreements without recourse to unreliable legal systems. Marwaris in India and various subgroups among the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia have even been able to engage in international trade with members of their own groups in other countries on the basis of verbal understandings. This can be an enormous competitive economic advantage in countries with unreliable legal and political institutions, when indigenous rivals have to be far more cautious about economic transactions. But even in a country with more reliable institutions, there are advantages in being able, as Hasidic Jews in New York are, to give each other consignments of jewels to sell and share the profits on the basis of verbal agreements. Whatever the level of honesty in a given society, there is no reason to expect existing disparities in these respects to remain the same forever, when so many other things have changed over the centuries. But at any given time, honesty is one of the many factors that vary, making equal chances for all very unlikely. Episodic factors. In addition to ongoing differences among peoples, there have also been unpredictable episodic events such as wars, famines, and epidemics that can disrupt the development path of particular peoples. The outcomes of military conflicts can be a matter of chances that are incalculable and yet able to determine the fate of whole societies or nations for subsequent generations or centuries. Had Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo instead of his enemy, the Duke of Wellington, the history of peoples and nations across the continent of Europe could have been very different. Wellington himself said afterwards that the outcome of that battle was, quote, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, end quote. It could have gone either way. Had the earlier battle against invading Islamic forces at Tours in 732 or at the siege of Vienna in 1529 gone the other way, Europe would be culturally a very different place today. As things turned out, Europe has been far from being a culturally, economically, or otherwise homogeneous civilization, with its peoples having the same quantity and kind of human capital across the continent. Instead, the languages of Western Europe acquired written versions centuries before the languages of Eastern Europe. This had major implications for the education of the peoples in these two regions, who had little chance to be equal in endeavors requiring the kinds of knowledge and skills taught from books in schools and colleges. This was not simply an inequality confined to the past, for the evolution to the present began from very different paths in very different places and times. Eastern Europe has been poorer and less industrial developed than Western Europe for centuries, and the homicide rate in Eastern Europe has been some multiple of the homicide rate in Western Europe for centuries. Nor was this east-west divide the only source of national inequalities within Europe. At the beginning of the 20th century, quote, when only 3% of the population of Great Britain was literate, the figure for Italy was 48%, for Spain 56%, for Portugal 78%, end quote. There were similar disparities in 1900 when the Habsburg Empire, where the rate of within the Habsburg Empire, where the rate of illiteracy ranged from 3% in Bohemia to 73% in Dalmatia. Massive scholarly studies have found great differences in both technological development and in the number of leading figures in the arts and sciences in different parts of Europe. It was much the same story in Africa, where in 1957 only 11% of the children attending secondary school in Nigeria were from the northern part of the country, where a majority of the population lived. Someone born in northern Nigeria had nowhere near the same chances as someone born in southern Nigeria, a fact reflected in the different economic successes of tribes from these different regions of the country. Both in Europe and in Nigeria, different circumstances led different groups to develop levels of literacy and different school attendance. In Europe, in centuries past, when people were far poorer, some groups working in agriculture had little need for literacy, but often had great need for the work of children in order to keep families adequately fed. In such circumstances, children's education was often sacrificed, depriving them of even second-hand knowledge of a wider world. In other parts of the world as well, innumerable factors influenced the development of innumerable peoples. It would be an incredible coincidence if all these factors affected all these people the same way during the many thousands of years in the past. What is also very unlikely, nor over vast expanses of time, is that the very same people would have been the highest achievers throughout many thousands of years. Just within a fraction of those millennia for which there has been recorded history, the peoples who have been in the forefront of human achievements have changed dramatically. For centuries, China was far more technologically advanced than any European nation, having cast iron 1,000 years before the Europeans. The Chinese also had mechanical printing on paper during centuries when Europeans were still writing by hand on costlier materials. Educating most Europeans with costly individual manuscripts rather than mass-produced books was not an economically viable prospect. Only after Europeans developed mechanical printing themselves was it feasible for them to educate more than a small fraction of their populations, and only after all the languages of different European peoples developed written versions was an equal education and the development of equal human capital even theoretically possible. Differences in human capital, including honesty and languages, as well as occupational skills and industrial and commercial talents, have been common between nations and within nations. There was no way that people on the short end of these circumstantial disparities had quote unquote equal chances of developing their capabilities even in a society with equal opportunity, in a sense of open competition for all and equal standards applied to all. We might agree that quote unquote equal chances for all would be desirable, but that in no way guarantees that we have either the knowledge or the power required to make that goal attainable, without ruinous sacrifices of other desirable goals ranging from freedom to survival. Do we want the mixture of students who are going to be trained to be advanced medical research to be representative of the demographic makeup of the population as a whole, or do we want whatever students from whatever background who have track records demonstrating a mastery of medical science that gives them the highest probability of finding cures for cancer, Alzheimer's, or other devastating diseases? Endeavors have purposes. Is indulging ideological visions more important than ending cancer and Alzheimer's? Do you want airlines to have pilots chosen from demographic representation of various groups, or would you prefer to fly on planes whose pilots were chosen for their mastery of all the complex things that increase your chances of arriving safely at your destination? Once we recognize the many factors that can create different developed capabilities, equal chances for all, quote unquote, becomes very different in its consequences from quote unquote equal opportunity. And consequences matter, or should matter, more so than some attractive or fashionable theory. More fundamentally, do we want a society in which some babies are born into the world as heirs of prepackaged grievances against other babies born the same day, blighting both their lives? Or do we want to at least leave them the option to work things out better in their lives than we have in ours? And that's actually the end of the chapter. And my voice is done. So, I am going to leave it off there. And we will pick it up Friday. So, let's see who is around. to raid, if anyone. Vesper's on. Haven't been over there for a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and raid Vesper. So bear with me a minute, and we'll head on over there.
Calling to say I